It started with a smile I wasn't supposed to notice, and a secret I was never meant to keep. I didn't expect the knock at the door to change much that day. I was just stopping by my friend's house, the same way I had a dozen times before. But when the door opened, and she stepped into view, something in the air shifted. She was nothing like the people I usually met in passing. There was a kind of ease about her, the way she stood in the doorway with one hand resting lightly on the frame, her eyes taking me in as though she already knew what kind of person I was. My friend had mentioned his aunt lived there, but nothing had prepared me for her. Her hair was pulled back in a way that revealed the graceful lines of her face. She had that look of someone who had grown into herself, not trying to impress, but still impossible not to notice. When she smiled politely in greeting, it wasn't the rushed smile of courtesy. It was warm, steady, as though she had time to actually see me. I introduced myself, my voice steadier than I felt, and she extended her hand. For a moment, I thought it would be quick, the kind of handshake that disappears as soon as it happens. But when her fingers touched mine, they didn't slip away immediately. Her grip was soft, sure, her skin warm against my palm. It was over in seconds, but the faint imprint of her touch seemed to linger, an echo pulsing quietly in my chest. She asked how long I had known her nephew, her tone light but carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. I answered, but half my mind was caught on the way she tilted her head slightly as she listened, like she was weighing more than just my words. The house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and something sweet cooling in the kitchen, but beneath that, I caught the trace of her perfume, subtle, not overpowering, a scent that seemed to belong only to her. She moved with an ease that was unhurried, graceful in ways I didn't expect. When she excused herself to return to what she had been doing, she gave me another small smile before she turned away. It was the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything, but left something behind. Something that stayed with me, even as my friend finally appeared, laughing and apologizing for taking so long. I nodded along, but truthfully, I wasn't thinking about him. I was still thinking about her. Later that afternoon, the house felt unusually calm. My friend had gone to grab something from outside, leaving me alone in the living room. I glanced around, letting my eyes wander across the framed photographs, the shelves filled with books that looked well read. It felt like a home that carried both history and warmth. Then I heard her voice. "Do you want something to drink?" she asked from the doorway. Her tone wasn't just polite, there was a lightness to it, almost teasing, as if she already knew I wouldn't say no. I followed her into the kitchen. She moved with that same quiet confidence I'd noticed earlier, every step unhurried, every motion deliberate. There was something about the way she reached for glasses, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, that made the simplest actions feel captivating. When she handed me a glass of water, her fingers brushed against mine. The touch was brief, accidental maybe, but it drew my attention more than anything else. I murmured thanks, hoping she couldn't hear the slight catch in my voice. "You don't cook, do you?" she asked suddenly, her eyes narrowing with playful suspicion as she glanced at me over her shoulder. I laughed. "Not really." "Why?" She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "I can always tell." Before I could ask what she meant, she opened a jar on the counter and gestured for me to come closer. "Here. Taste this." It was jam, sweet and rich, and I nodded quickly in approval. She laughed softly, the sound warm and musical, and shook her head. "See? No hesitation. A good student already." Her choice of words stuck with me, student. Something about the way she said it carried a different weight, like there was more beneath it than a simple joke. As she leaned in to show me how she spread the jam across a piece of bread, her shoulder brushed mine. It wasn't much, just the faintest contact, but my skin felt alive where it happened. She didn't pull away quickly. If anything, she lingered, her presence close enough for me to notice the subtle fragrance of her perfume again, soft, elegant, familiar already. For a moment, the kitchen felt smaller, quieter, as if it had drawn in around us. She looked at me then, her eyes catching mine in a way that made it difficult to look anywhere else. There was laughter there, yes, but also something deeper, something unspoken. Then my friend's voice carried in from outside, breaking the spell. She smiled again, casually, as if nothing had just passed between us. But I knew something had. The next day, I found myself back at my friend's house. I told myself it was just coincidence, just another hangout, but deep down I knew I was curious if I'd see her again. It didn't take long. She appeared in the kitchen while I was sitting at the counter, her sleeves rolled up, hair loosely tied, moving with the same graceful calm that had caught my attention before. She glanced at me, a spark of amusement in her eyes. "You look bored," she said, setting a bowl on the counter. I shrugged, smiling. "Maybe a little." "Well, then you can help me." Her tone was playful, almost commanding, though softened by the faintest smile. She slid a cutting board toward me, placing a knife in my hand. I laughed nervously. "I told you yesterday, I don't cook." "Exactly," she replied, stepping closer. "That's why I'll teach you." It could have been nothing, just a casual favor, but the way she said it felt different, as if there was meaning tucked inside her words. She stood behind me, adjusting how I held the knife. Her hand slid gently over mine, her touch light but deliberate. "Not like that," she murmured, guiding my wrist. The warmth of her skin against mine was impossible to ignore. Every small movement she made seemed magnified, her presence filling all the space around me. I tried to focus, but the closeness unsettled me in a way I couldn't put into words. She leaned in, her voice low, her cheek nearly brushing my shoulder. "See? It's not difficult. You just need to be shown once." Her perfume drifted faintly in the air, mingling with the scent of fresh herbs on the counter. My heart raced faster than the situation deserved, but she seemed perfectly calm, her hand still resting over mine as if time had slowed down. I finally glanced sideways, and for just a moment, our eyes met. There was nothing hurried in her gaze, no embarrassment, no apology. Only a quiet, steady confidence, paired with the hint of something I couldn't yet name. When she finally let go, it felt like something had been taken from me, a closeness I hadn't realized I'd grown attached to in those few minutes. "Not bad," she said, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "You learn quickly." And just like that, she turned back to the counter, as though nothing unusual had happened. But for me, the lesson had been more than just about cooking. It had been about her, and the way she seemed to draw me in without even trying. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft clatter of dishes and the steady rhythm of her movements. My friend had stepped out again, leaving just the two of us in the room. I told myself it was nothing unusual, but the silence between us felt heavy, filled with an awareness that hadn't been there before yesterday. She slid a plate across the counter toward me. "Try this," she said, her voice casual. I obeyed, though the food hardly mattered. What mattered was the way she leaned slightly against the counter, her arms crossed loosely, her eyes fixed on me with a glimmer of amusement. She was watching me too closely for it to be about food. "You're not half bad," I said, smiling, trying to fill the quiet. Her lips curved into that mischievous smile I was starting to recognize. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that it felt like she didn't want anyone else, even someone in another room, to hear. "Don't tell him I taught you this," she whispered, nodding toward the door where her nephew had disappeared. The words were simple, but the way she said them shifted everything. They weren't just playful instructions, they felt like a shared secret, a line drawn between us that excluded everyone else. Her breath brushed against my ear as she spoke, warm and delicate, and my chest tightened in response. I turned my head slightly, surprised by how close she was. Her face was only inches from mine, her eyes holding mine with quiet intensity. For a suspended second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile from our first meeting, but one that held a private daring, as if she knew exactly how her words and nearness unsettled me. I swallowed, forcing a small laugh. All right. Our secret. Her smile deepened, satisfied. She pulled back just slightly, but not far enough to erase the closeness. The air still carried the warmth of her presence, the faint trace of her perfume. The moment stretched, longer than it should have, longer than either of us probably intended. It wasn't just about a recipe anymore. It was about the unspoken understanding that something had passed between us, fragile and dangerous, yet impossible to ignore. When footsteps echoed from the hall, she straightened quickly, returning to the counter as if nothing had happened. But when I looked at her again, she caught my gaze and gave the faintest shake of her head, paired with another soft smile. As though reminding me, some things were meant to be kept quiet. The days that followed were filled with small, quiet moments that seemed to stretch endlessly in my mind long after they passed. I couldn't explain why, but I found myself noticing her in ways I hadn't before. The way she walked through a room, the casual tilt of her head when she laughed, the subtle brush of her hand against mine, every movement left a trace I couldn't shake. We didn't speak much of it. The tension between us wasn't loud or overt. It was the kind of unspoken understanding that exists in shared glances and fleeting touches, in the space between words. Even when we were surrounded by my friend or other family members, there were moments, a brief look, a lingering smile, that felt entirely ours. One afternoon, we found ourselves in the living room together while my friend stepped outside. I was reading quietly, and she was arranging flowers in a vase. Without thinking, I reached for a book on the shelf, and our hands brushed lightly. My pulse quickened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers linger against mine for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. The room was warm, the sunlight spilling across the floor, catching the soft shimmer of her hair. For a second, everything felt suspended. I could sense her awareness of me, just as I was acutely aware of her, the subtle warmth radiating from her skin, the quiet energy that seemed to fill the air between us. We didn't speak. There was no need. The silence was its own language. Her eyes flicked to mine, and I caught a shadow of emotion there, amusement, curiosity, something tender and fragile. I smiled, and she returned it, a slow, deliberate smile that made my chest tighten. Later, as we moved around the room to tidy up, our knees brushed under the low coffee table. A small, accidental touch, yet neither of us pulled back. It was enough to make the air between us almost crackle, a private current running under the surface of ordinary life. It was these small moments, the soft laughter, the unspoken glances, the gentle contact, that kept me coming back in thought and anticipation. I realized that the secret we shared, the whispered lesson in the kitchen, had opened a door to something neither of us wanted to name yet. By the time my friend returned, the quiet closeness had receded into the ordinary rhythm of the house. But the tension remained, simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't bold or desperate. It was patient, subtle, and entirely irresistible. Every time I looked at her after that, I felt it, the silent pull that tethered us together, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. It was quiet in the living room that evening, the golden glow of sunset spilling across the floor. My friend had gone out for a while, leaving just the two of us again. There was something different in the air this time, softer, more fragile. I could sense a shift in her, a subtle tension that wasn't there before. She sat across from me, hands folded loosely in her lap. For a moment, she didn't speak, just looked at me with eyes that seemed to weigh more than words could convey. I realized that behind her confidence and composed exterior, there was a vulnerability she rarely let anyone see. "Do you ever feel," she began, then paused, as if unsure whether to continue. I leaned forward slightly, encouraging her without needing her to fill the silence. "Go on," I said quietly. She took a deep breath, and then words started to spill out, stories of loneliness, moments of doubt, the quiet isolation she sometimes felt even in a house full of people. She spoke carefully, but with a trust that I didn't take lightly. I listened intently, aware of the weight of her words and the courage it took to share them. As she spoke, she shifted slightly closer, resting her hand lightly on my forearm. Her fingers brushed softly against my skin, tentative, almost seeking reassurance. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a depth of meaning, a silent request to be understood, to be heard, and perhaps, to be cared for. I responded not with advice or flattery, but with steady attention. I let her know, through quiet nods and gentle words, that I was present, that her trust wasn't misplaced. She seemed to relax, her shoulders dropping slightly, the tension in her posture easing. For the first time, the teasing, playful tone between us was replaced with something deeper, a genuine connection that didn't need to be rushed or labeled. I could feel the warmth of her presence, the subtle beat of her heart against my forearm, and it struck me how profoundly intimate such a small touch could feel. She smiled at me then, softly, not the daring or mischievous smiles of before, but one that carried relief and trust. I smiled back, equally aware of the fragile thread we had woven between us, a bond that felt real and tender. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm orange hue over the room, I realized that the attraction I felt for her had grown beyond playful curiosity. It was rooted now in understanding, in trust, in the quiet intimacy of shared vulnerability. And for the first time, I sensed that she felt it too, that whatever this was between us, it was becoming something undeniable, quietly profound, and entirely ours. It was evening when I stood near the door, my jacket in hand, ready to leave. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp she had turned on, and the lingering scent of the flowers she'd arranged earlier. Everything felt slower, heavier, more meaningful. She appeared behind me, her presence immediate yet gentle. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made me pause. "For keeping my little secret." I nodded, unsure how much to say, my chest tight with the weight of the unspoken. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heart was anything but. Her eyes met mine, and for a suspended moment, the world outside that room, my friend, the rest of the house, even time itself, ceased to exist. There was something in her gaze, quiet and steady, that made it impossible to look anywhere else. It wasn't bold, it wasn't hurried, but it held a promise, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond we had formed over whispered words and shared moments. She stepped closer, her hand brushing my shoulder lightly. The touch was brief, delicate, almost ceremonial, yet it sent a warmth spiraling through me, leaving me aware of every nerve ending, every heartbeat. She didn't pull away quickly, instead, she lingered just long enough for the moment to etch itself into memory. Then she smiled. Not a casual or playful smile, not the teasing ones that had marked our first encounters. This one was quiet, tender, and daring all at once. It was a smile that said, "I see you. I trust you. And maybe, you feel the same way I do." I smiled back, a mix of relief, longing, and something deeper I hadn't allowed myself to name until now. That smile carried the weight of all the moments we had shared, the brushed hands, the lingering glances, the whispered secrets. It was the culmination of everything that had quietly, insistently drawn us together. She gave a slight nod, as if affirming something without words, and turned to walk back toward the kitchen. I lingered by the door a moment longer, tracing the memory of her touch on my shoulder, the warmth of her presence that seemed to linger even as she moved away. When I finally stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt the pull of her still beside me, invisible yet undeniable. And though we said nothing more, I knew, we had crossed into something new, something quietly profound, something that neither of us needed to explain. That night, as I walked home, I realized that her smile had changed everything. Not through grand gestures or bold confessions, but through quiet understanding, shared trust, and a simple, unspoken acknowledgement of a connection neither time nor circumstance could ignore. And for the first time, I knew with certainty that this was only the beginning. It was evening when I stood near the door, my jacket in hand, ready to leave. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp she had turned on, and the lingering scent of the flowers she'd arranged earlier. Everything felt slower, heavier, more meaningful. She appeared behind me, her presence immediate yet gentle. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made me pause. For keeping my little secret. I nodded, unsure how much to say, my chest tight with the weight of the unspoken. Of course, I replied, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heart was anything but. Her eyes met mine, and for a suspended moment, the world outside that room, my friend, the rest of the house, even time itself, ceased to exist. There was something in her gaze, quiet and steady, that made it impossible to look anywhere else. It wasn't bold, it wasn't hurried, but it held a promise, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond we had formed over whispered words and shared moments. She stepped closer, her hand brushing my shoulder lightly. The touch was brief, delicate, almost ceremonial, yet it sent a warmth spiraling through me, leaving me aware of every nerve ending, every heartbeat. She didn't pull away quickly, instead, she lingered just long enough for the moment to etch itself into memory. Then she smiled. Not a casual or playful smile, not the teasing ones that had marked our first encounters. This one was quiet, tender, and daring all at once. It was a smile that said, "I see you. I trust you. And maybe, you feel the same way I do." I smiled back, a mix of relief, longing, and something deeper I hadn't allowed myself to name until now. That smile carried the weight of all the moments we had shared, the brushed hands, the lingering glances, the whispered secrets. As she turned to walk back toward the kitchen, I lingered a moment longer, tracing the memory of her touch on my shoulder, the warmth of her presence that seemed to linger even as she moved away. And though we said nothing more, I knew, we had crossed into something new, something quietly profound, something that neither of us needed to explain. That night, as I walked home, I realized her smile had changed everything. Not through grand gestures or bold confessions, but through quiet understanding, shared trust, and a simple, unspoken acknowledgement of a connection neither time nor circumstance could ignore. If you want to see how this slow-burn romance began, all the small moments that led to this smile, the full story is waiting, check the link in the description. You won't want to miss it.